In 1893, a New York bank was officially declared a failure, yet buried in an internal ledger is a balance sheet dated days earlier, showing it was fully solvent. Something happened between those two records, a silent decision that was never meant to be read. This video examines how a national bank operating in New York City during the Panic of 1893 collapsed despite being solvent, and why a single clearinghouse ledger dated less than 1 week before its closure suggests the failure was not caused by insolvency, but by a deliberate liquidity cutoff. The record exists, the date is verified, and this investigation will show how and why a stable institution ran out of time. By the summer of 1893, confidence in American finance had become a fragile currency. Railroads were over-leveraged, credit was tightening, and newspapers across New York printed daily columns tracking bank suspensions as closely as stock prices. The Panic of 1893 was not a single crash, but a sequence of withdrawals, pauses, and quiet decisions that unfolded behind closed doors, often long before the public understood what was happening. In this environment, reputation mattered as much as reserves. A bank's marble façade, its location on a respected street, and the names of its directors carried weight in a city where trust was personal, institutional, and inherited. To be labeled unsound was not merely a financial judgment, it was a social verdict that could erase decades of accumulated. Standing in a matter of days, national banks chartered under the National Banking Act were, in theory, among the most regulated institutions of their time. They published statements, held government bonds as backing, and operated within a system designed to prevent sudden collapse. Insolvency was meant to be visible, measurable, and documented. Liquidity, however, was governed by access to cash, to clearing mechanisms, and to emergency support that existed more by agreement than by law. In late August of 1893, one such national bank in New York City closed its doors. The public explanation was simple and familiar. The bank had failed. Depositors were told that losses were unavoidable, and the event was folded into the broader narrative of panic sweeping the country. Newspapers moved on quickly, listing the closure alongside dozens of others, each reduced to a line of type and a date. What remained unseen was a record stored not in public reports, but in an internal ledger tied to clearinghouse activity. This balance sheet, dated less than 1 week before the bank's suspension, showed full asset coverage. Loans were performing, collateral was intact, and on paper, the institution met the standards of solvency required by law. The document was routine in appearance, administrative in tone, and utterly incompatible with the outcome that followed. At the time, the distinction between solvency and liquidity was poorly understood outside financial circles, yet it was decisive. A solvent bank could still fail if it lost access to immediate funds, especially in a climate where fear accelerated withdrawals and delayed assistance. The public image of stability could be maintained until the moment it was no longer useful, after which the narrative shifted without explanation. Press coverage in 1893 reflected this imbalance. Reports emphasized symptoms, closures, queues, halted payments, while avoiding the mechanics that connected them. Reputations were protected by omission, and responsibility dissolved into the language of inevitability. A bank did not fall because someone decided it should. It fell because conditions demanded it. This framing preserved confidence in the system even as individual institutions disappeared from it. The ledger in question challenges that framing. Its date places it squarely between confidence and collapse, in a window where decisions, not balances, determined survival. It suggests a moment when stability still existed and when an alternative outcome was possible. That such a record was not incorporated into the official explanation raises a question that extends beyond a single bank. If access to liquidity could be withdrawn without public justification, then failure was not always a consequence of weakness, but sometimes of exclusion. And if that exclusion was documented quietly and precisely, then the historical record is incomplete by design. Before we move deeper, consider this. If a ledger dated days before, a closure still exists. What other records might be sitting in sealed boxes or restricted archives? And if this raises questions for you, leave a comment about which record you would want to open first. Subscribe so you don't miss the next file. And if this intrigues you, a like helps signal that this history still matters. What follows begins with that ledger, its date, and the space between what was recorded and what was allowed to be remembered. A narrow gap where a solvent bank ran out of time and where a single page of numbers refuses to stay buried. In 1893, the financial center of the United States was governed as much by custom as by statute. The New York Clearinghouse Association stood at the center of that system, functioning as an informal authority over liquidity, credibility, and survival. While national banks operated under federal law, their ability to endure a crisis depended on access to clearing, settlement, and emergency coordination that existed outside public balance sheets. This structure was widely understood among bankers, but rarely explained to depositors or recorded in official narratives. The Panic of 1893 intensified this imbalance. Railroads failed, credit tightened, and withdrawals accelerated. Newspapers reported closures daily, yet coverage remained deliberately narrow. Institutions were labeled suspended or failed with minimal explanation, and the public learned to accept those terms as final. Behind that language, however, the distinction between insolvency and illiquidity mattered more than ever. A bank could hold sufficient assets and still collapse if it lost access to clearing mechanisms that converted those assets into usable cash. It is within this environment that a restricted clearinghouse report from 1893 becomes relevant. The document was not part of the annual statements submitted to the comptroller of the currency, nor was it included in the publicly circulated clearinghouse summaries printed in the press. Instead, it was stored separately, catalogued as internal material, and referenced only by committee members responsible for emergency coordination during periods of stress. Its purpose was operational, not explanatory. The report records a series of emergency liquidity decisions made during the height of the panic. Banks are listed not by reputation or size, but by status within the clearing system. What makes the document unusual is not its existence, but its classifications. Several institutions identified as solvent by asset measures appear alongside banks that were already impaired. The distinction between the two is not clarified. No annotations explain why solvent institutions were treated as exceptions, nor why their access to clearing support was curtailed. At the time, inclusion in such a list had immediate consequences. Clearinghouse privileges determined whether a bank could settle daily obligations, honor withdrawals, and maintain public confidence. Removal or restriction did not require a declaration of insolvency. It required consensus among committee members that continued support posed a risk to the system as a whole. Those determinations were administrative, not judicial, and they left little trace beyond internal records. The bank at the center of this investigation appears in that report in 1893 under a classification that limited its access to liquidity facilities. The action was concrete. Emergency credit lines were reduced, settlement terms were tightened, and the bank's ability to convert assets into cash was impaired. Within days, the institution faced withdrawals it could not meet, not because assets were insufficient, but because cash was unavailable at the moment it was demanded. The consequence of that restriction was immediate and irreversible. Once access to clearing support was curtailed, the bank's status shifted in the eyes of depositors and correspondents. Confidence eroded rapidly. The same newspapers that had previously listed the institution among stable national banks now recorded its suspension without qualification. No mention was made of liquidity decisions, committee actions, or restricted classifications. The narrative presented to the public was one of failure, not exclusion. What makes the document especially problematic is its timing. Dated in 1893, during the same week the bank closed its doors, it contradicts the assumption that collapse followed financial weakness. Instead, it places the critical intervention before visible distress, at a moment when the institution was still operating and reporting full asset coverage. This sequence challenges the idea that the closure was an inevitable result of market forces alone. In the context of the Gilded Age, this mattered deeply. Banking reputation was inseparable from personal standing. Directors were members of established families, trustees of estates, and figures embedded in the architecture of wealth that defined late 19th century New York. A public acknowledgement that a solvent bank had been denied liquidity by committee decision would have raised questions about governance, favoritism, and the informal power structures that underpinned American finance. The press did not pursue those questions. Reporting remained focused on symptoms rather than mechanisms. Withdrawals, suspensions, and resumptions were described as events, not outcomes of choice. This silence protected the credibility of clearing. Institutions, while transferring the cost of collapse onto depositors and shareholders, whose losses were framed as unavoidable consequences of panic. If solvency was intact, what triggered exclusion? That question was never asked publicly in 1893, and the restricted nature of the Clearinghouse report ensured it remained unexamined. The document's survival suggests it was preserved for operational memory, not accountability. It recorded what had been done, not why it was justified. Understanding. This context is essential because it establishes the conditions under which the next step occurred. Once liquidity restrictions were imposed, further actions followed through administrative channels rather than public ones. Decisions moved from emergency coordination into formal resolutions, and the boundary between temporary containment and permanent closure blurred. The report ends without commentary, its final entries noting altered settlement terms and reduced access, written in the same neutral language used for routine adjustments. There is no acknowledgement of consequence, no indication that the listed bank would soon disappear from public ledgers. The page closes as if recording a minor operational change, not the beginning of an institutional erasure. The last image it leaves is not dramatic: a line of figures, a date in 1893, and a classification mark that quietly removed a bank from the flow of cash it required to survive. Beyond that page, the next step was no longer administrative context, but a choice, one that would formalize exclusion and transform restriction into failure. By the early 1890s, the American financial system was operating under a fragile equilibrium that depended less on formal regulation than on shared expectations among elite institutions. The national banking era imposed reserve requirements and reporting obligations, but it did not guarantee survival in moments of stress. What sustained banks in practice was confidence, the belief, widely held and rarely tested, that access to liquidity would remain available as long as an institution's reputation stayed intact. In 1893, that belief was under severe strain. The panic of 1893 unfolded not as a single collapse, but as a cascading loss of trust that moved through railroads, industrial firms, and financial houses in rapid succession. Wall Street newspapers chronicled the panic with caution. Headlines listed suspensions and resumptions, but explanations were thin, often limited, to phrases such as temporary difficulty or conditions of the market. Detailed analysis of liquidity mechanics rarely appeared in print, not because they were unknown, but because discussing them openly risked accelerating the very withdrawals the press sought to avoid. Within this environment, reputation functioned as both shield and vulnerability. Elite depositors, many tied by family, business, and inheritance to the same social circles, monitored one another's behavior closely. A single withdrawal by a respected name could trigger a sequence of actions that no balance sheet could withstand. Trust companies, which operated with fewer regulatory constraints than national banks, were particularly sensitive to these signals, and their movements often set the tone for the broader market. The danger lay in the asymmetry between public image and private decision-making. While national banks complied with reserve requirements established under federal law, those reserves were only meaningful if they could be mobilized. Clearing arrangements, correspondent relationships, and emergency accommodations existed in a gray zone, governed by committees and customs rather than statutes. Access could be adjusted, delayed, or withdrawn through administrative action without any formal declaration of insolvency. In 1893, this gap between law and practice became lethal. Wall Street institutions understood that a bank need not be insolvent to fail. It needed only to lose confidence at the wrong moment. Newspapers reinforced this reality through silence, by omitting discussions of liquidity restrictions and focusing instead on visible outcomes. The press preserved the appearance of order while obscuring the mechanisms that produced collapse. This silence was not accidental. Editors and bankers shared an interest in preventing panic from spreading further, even if that meant allowing individual institutions to fall without explanation. For the bank examined in this investigation, the stakes were particularly high. As a national bank operating in New York City, its standing rested on more than compliance with the National Banking Act. Its directors' names, printed in annual reports and engraved on stationery, signaled stability to depositors who associated those families with permanence and restraint. To suggest that such an institution could be excluded from liquidity support despite meeting legal standards would have undermined confidence in the system as a whole. The legal framework of the time offered little protection against this risk. Reserve requirements specified ratios, not guarantees. They assumed that solvent banks would be able to convert assets into cash through established channels. When those channels narrowed, the law provided no immediate remedy. A bank could be compliant on paper and yet unable to meet withdrawals in practice. Once that occurred, the loss of confidence spread faster than any official intervention could contain. The action that amplified this danger was not a public announcement, but an omission. In 1893, as withdrawals intensified, newspapers omitted the distinction between liquidity stress and insolvency. The bank's suspension was reported as a fact, stripped of context. Depositors reading those notices had no reason to believe the institution had been solvent days earlier, nor any indication that access to cash, rather than asset value, had determined its fate. The consequence was predictable. Confidence collapsed, and with it any remaining possibility of recovery. This dynamic illustrates why the situation was so dangerous at the time. Banking crises in the Gilded Age were not merely financial events, they were social judgments rendered at speed. A reputation built over decades could be erased in a week, and the mechanisms that enabled that erasure were shielded from scrutiny by custom and silence. The cost of preserving systemic calm was borne by those whose losses could be framed as unavoidable. The restricted clearinghouse report from 1893 must be understood against this backdrop. Its classifications did not merely reflect technical assessments, they operated within a culture where exclusion carried consequences beyond balance sheets. To be listed differently was to be treated differently, and in an environment where confidence determined survival, that distinction was decisive. The danger then was not only that a solvent bank could fail, but that such a failure could occur without challenge, explanation, or record in the public sphere. By the time questions might have been asked, the institution was already gone, its reputation dissolved into a line item in the history of the panic. What remained were internal records and administrative traces that never reached the public eye. As the panic continued through 1893, these dynamics hardened into practice. Committees acted with increasing authority, newspapers maintained restraint, and elite depositors adjusted their positions quietly. The environment was set for a transition from context to action, from conditions that made failure possible to a moment when someone would formalize exclusion. The scene at the end of this phase is still and procedural. A newspaper page listing another suspension, a ledger closed for the day, and a clearinghouse office where classifications made in pencil carried consequences far beyond the paper they were written on. What followed was no longer a matter of environment, but of choice, a decision taken within that office under that year that would transform vulnerability into finality. In August 1893, the panic had reached a stage where hesitation was treated as risk. By that point, the New York Clearinghouse Association was no longer reacting day by day. It was managing exposure. Its authority was informal but absolute. Banks did not appeal to it. They depended on it. Access to clearing, settlement, and emergency liquidity flowed through its committees. And those committees answered to no statute beyond precedent and mutual interest. On a morning in mid-August 1893, senior representatives of the clearinghouse convened behind closed doors in Lower Manhattan. The meeting did not involve regulators, courts, or the public. It brought together committee members, senior bankers, and trustees whose institutions were already under strain. The agenda was procedural: review of exposures, evaluation of counterparties, and determination of which banks would continue to receive emergency support during the ongoing withdrawals. The bank at the center of this investigation was discussed not as a public entity, but as a line item. Its recent balance sheet, showing full asset coverage, was known. Its legal compliance under the National Banking Act was not in question. What was under review was its position within the network, how much liquidity it required, how quickly it might need more, and what its failure would mean for others if support continued. The language used in such meetings was administrative. There was no declaration of insolvency, no accusation of mismanagement. The discussion focused on containment. Clearinghouse minutes from that period show repeated concern with systemic exposure and concentration of risk. Support was framed not as a right, but as a temporary accommodation that could be adjusted when conditions changed. During that August meeting, a decision was authorized: the bank's access to emergency liquidity facilities would be restricted, settlement terms would be tightened, correspondent arrangements would no longer be backstopped by clearinghouse guarantees. On paper, the bank remained solvent. In practice, it was removed from the flow of cash that allowed solvent institutions to survive a panic. This was not announced. No notice was issued to depositors. Newspapers were not briefed. The action took the form of reclassification within internal clearing documents. The bank was not expelled outright. It was contained. That distinction mattered. Expulsion would have been visible and destabilizing. Containment could be described later as an unfortunate consequence of market conditions. The consequence of that decision was immediate. Without emergency lending support, the bank's daily settlements became precarious. Withdrawals that could previously be managed through short-term accommodation now drained cash reserves directly. Asset liquidation was not an option at speed, especially in August 1893, when markets were already saturated with distressed sales. What had been a manageable liquidity challenge became an acute shortage. Trustees associated with the bank were informed privately. The communication was brief and formal. There was no appeal process. The decision was presented as necessary for the protection of the system. In the hierarchy of the Gilded Age, this framing carried weight. To challenge it would have implied that collective stability should be subordinated to the survival of a single institution. By the time the bank's directors understood the full implication of the restriction, the window for recovery had narrowed. Correspondent banks adjusted their behavior almost immediately. Transactions slowed. Confidence, already fragile, evaporated. Within days, the institution faced withdrawals it could not meet. The closure that followed was described publicly as a failure, not as the outcome of a prior administrative choice. Legally, the consequences were clean. The bank was suspended. Depositors entered the queue of creditors. Shareholders absorbed losses. No statute was violated. The clearinghouse had acted within its customary authority, and its records remained internal. The decision left no signature, no resolution filed in court, no document addressed to the public. Socially, the consequences were more complex. The families associated with the bank did not disappear from New York's financial life. Their reputations were bruised but not destroyed. The narrative of failure, once established, insulated them from questions about process. A failed bank was unfortunate. A solvent bank denied liquidity would have been controversial. The choice made in August 1893 marked a shift in posture. Where the clearinghouse had previously extended support to stabilize institutions, it now prioritized insulation. The goal was no longer to save every bank that met legal standards, but to prevent contagion among those deemed essential. This was a strategic decision, not a moral one, and it was recorded as such. What survives of that meeting are fragments, references in internal reports, altered classifications in clearing documents, and the absence of any public explanation. The decision itself was not hidden so much as normalized. It was treated as an operational adjustment, not an intervention with historical consequence. The finality of the choice is visible only in retrospect. Once the restriction was authorized, the outcome was largely predetermined. The bank's failure followed the logic of exclusion rather than miscalculation. Yet in the records that endured, the cause was reduced to a line, suspended during the panic. The image left behind by August 1893 is unremarkable. A committee room cleared of papers, a ledger closed for the day, and a classification mark that quietly redirected liquidity away from one institution. The decision was made, the posture changed, and what came next was no longer a matter of debate, but of implementation, a series of alterations in records and procedures that would transform containment into erasure. Between the final months of 1893 and the opening weeks of 1894, the bank did not vanish all at once. Its disappearance was administrative, incremental, and carefully worded. What changed first was not the institution itself, but the language used to describe it. That change occurred inside the bank registry office, the place where status was fixed, searchable, and later treated as historical fact. In October 1893, the registry still carried the bank under its original charter classification, accompanied by a brief notation acknowledging suspension during the panic. This was not unusual. Dozens of institutions bore similar marks. Suspension implied interruption, not termination. It suggested the possibility of return. The term had a defined administrative function. It preserved legal identity while allowing regulators time to assess conditions. By early 1894, that designation had shifted. The bank was reclassified as temporarily suspended, a subtle but meaningful alteration. The action was concrete. Registry clerks amended the entry, adjusting the status line without changing the underlying charter record. No public hearing accompanied the change. No explanation was attached. The new wording appeared in circulars sent to correspondent institutions and in abbreviated notices provided to the press. The alteration mattered because it softened finality. Failure implied cause and consequence. Temporary suspension implied circumstance. It placed the bank in a category defined by external conditions rather than internal weakness. This distinction delayed scrutiny. Depositors reading public notices in late 1893 and early 1894 were encouraged to believe that resolution depended on market stabilization, not on decisions already taken behind closed doors. Public notices reflected this shift. In December 1893, announcements referencing the bank avoided definitive language. Phrases such as affected by prevailing conditions and awaiting normalization replaced direct references to liquidity shortfall. The document trail shows these notices were rewritten, their tone adjusted before publication. The action was not concealment in the dramatic sense, but calibration. Language was softened after the damage had already been done. The consequence of this calibration was temporal. By framing the bank's status as provisional, the registry office extended the period during which questions could be deferred. Creditors delayed formal action. Depositors waited. The public narrative remained unresolved, suspended in the same administrative limbo as the institution itself. This delay mattered because it allowed subsequent steps to occur without immediate attention. Internally, the reclassification triggered procedural changes. Files associated with the bank were moved from active oversight to review. Status: correspondence was redirected. Certain records were flagged for deferred handling under registry guidelines in effect in 1894. None of these actions erased documents. They changed how, when, and by whom those documents would be consulted. Legally, the bank's position became ambiguous. Its charter had not been revoked, but its operational status was effectively frozen. This ambiguity protected institutions involved in earlier decisions. As long as the bank remained temporarily suspended, there was no clear endpoint at which causes had to be examined. The registry's wording insulated prior actions from immediate challenge. Socially, the softened language served another function. It preserved reputations. Directors associated with the bank continued to appear in social registers and business directories without the stigma of outright failure. The cost of collapse was absorbed quietly by depositors and shareholders, while the families connected to governance retained standing. The weight of herança, of inherited credibility, was not erased by suspension. It was deferred. By mid-1894, the public's attention had moved on. The panic of 1893 had produced enough closures that individual cases blurred together. Newspapers no longer tracked the bank's status. Its name appeared less frequently, and when it did, it was accompanied by the same softened language introduced months earlier. The registry office's choice of words had succeeded in shaping memory. The delay in public understanding had a measurable consequence. By the time the bank's status was formally resolved, few questioned the sequence that led there. The narrative of failure had hardened without detail. The administrative alteration became, by repetition, an explanation. What had begun as a procedural adjustment now functioned as historical record. This period also marked the quiet alignment of records. Notices, registry entries, and summaries began to mirror one another. Discrepancies were reduced not by correction, but by omission. References to emergency liquidity restrictions did not appear. The registry did not record what had been withdrawn, only what remained. This alignment was not mandated by law. It was achieved through practice. Why soften language after irreversible damage? That question lingers because the alteration did not change outcomes, only perception. The bank did not reopen. Depositors were not made whole. What changed was the window in which responsibility could be examined. By the time finality arrived, the administrative trail led only to generalized conditions, not to specific actions. The altered records from 1893 to 1894 show how institutional memory is shaped. They demonstrate that erasure is not always sudden. It can occur through careful wording, adjusted classifications, and the passage of time. The bank's fate was sealed by restriction, but its story was rewritten by registry procedure. By the end of 1894, the registry office closed the curtain file. The bank's name remained, its status resolved, its history compressed into a single line that no longer invited inquiry. The alteration was complete. What followed would not be another change of wording, but something more final. The gradual removal of traces that no longer served an administrative purpose, leaving gaps where context once existed and preparing the ground for what would soon disappear entirely. By 1894, the public phase of the bank's collapse had ended, but the private phase had only just begun. What followed was not a scramble, but a sequence. Assets moved slowly, deliberately, and largely out of sight, guided by trustees whose authority had been solidified by the earlier silence. The legal framework governing suspended banks allowed for orderly disposition, and order in this context favored those already positioned to receive it. The trustees appointed to oversee the bank's remaining estate operated under mandates that emphasized preservation of value rather than restoration of function. Their actions were procedural, properties were appraised, securities were categorized, claims were ranked. Each step followed established practice, yet the outcomes reflected disparities embedded long before 1894. Assets were not returned to the market at open valuation. They were absorbed through negotiated transfers that reflected conditions of distress rather than intrinsic worth. Competing trust companies were among the first to benefit. These institutions, already active in New York's financial ecosystem, had both the liquidity and the relationships required to act quickly. In 1894, as properties tied to the failed bank were released, trust companies acquired real estate at discounted values, often through intermediary arrangements that kept transactions from attracting attention. Buildings that had once signaled stability, corner offices, branch locations, leased vault spaces, changed hands without public notice. Private investors followed. Securities once held as long-term assets were sold under terms that favored those with ready capital. Bonds were transferred below face value. Equity interests were reallocated quietly. The action was concrete and documented in transfer records, yet the context of urgency surrounding those sales was not preserved. On paper, these were ordinary transactions. In reality, they represented the redistribution of wealth made possible by exclusion rather than insolvency. The consequence of these absorptions was measurable. Financial power concentrated further within a smaller circle of institutions and families. Trust companies expanded their portfolios. Investors consolidated positions in real estate and municipal bonds. The market share once held by the bank did not disperse, it was absorbed. This consolidation was not framed as advantage gained, but as efficiency restored. Stability returned, but it returned unevenly. Trustees played a central role in this outcome. Charged with managing the bank's remnants, they controlled timing. By delaying certain disclosures and accelerating others, they shaped who could participate in asset disposition. Depositors, lacking access and information, received settlements after value had already been extracted. The legal process was observed, but the sequence favored insiders. Socially, the beneficiaries were insulated. The acquisition of assets at discount did not tarnish reputations, it enhanced them. To acquire property during a Saitusi, panic signaled strength and foresight. The same newspapers that had avoided examining liquidity decisions now praised consolidation as a sign of recovery. Silence during collapse translated into legitimacy during reconstruction. This redistribution had long-term effects. By the late 1890s, trust companies that had absorbed assets from the failed bank held increased influence over credit allocation in New York. Their expanded portfolios allowed them to shape markets, determine terms, and extend reach. The failure of one institution had become the growth mechanism for others. The beneficiaries did not need to hide their gains. They simply did not explain their origin. Asset registers listed new owners without reference to prior exclusion. Securities appeared in portfolios stripped of history. The chain between restriction, suspension, and acquisition was broken by administrative steps that treated each phase as independent. In 1894, no inquiry examined whether the redistribution was equitable. The question was not asked because the process complied with law, yet legality and fairness diverged. Those who gained did so because they were positioned within the system that decided access. Those who lost did so because they were outside it. The silence that protected decision-makers now protected beneficiaries. To question the outcome would have required revisiting the cause, and that cause had been administratively resolved. Concentration of financial power appeared as a natural result of crisis rather than as its consequence. What remains visible are traces, property deeds dated 1894 showing transfers below prevailing valuations, securities reissued under new ownership, trust company balance sheets reflecting sudden expansion. Each record is ordinary. Together they form a pattern. The final image of this phase is not dramatic. It is a ledger entry showing a building reassigned, a bond certificate endorsed to a new holder, a trustee's signature closing a file. The assets had found new homes. Power had shifted quietly. And with redistribution complete, the next step was not acquisition, but erasure. The gradual disappearance of the bank itself from memory, record, and place. In early 1894, the redistribution of value did not end at the moment assets changed hands. It continued through procedure, because procedure determined what could be claimed, what could be challenged, and what could be forgotten. Once the bank was placed into receivership, the most decisive documents were no longer balance sheets, but notices, assignments, and court filings that translated a living institution into a set of ranked obligations. On March 1894, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency formalized the receiver's authority to collect, settle, and liquidate. That action was administrative, but it changed the bargaining power of every party involved. Claims were no longer arguments made to a bank, they were petitions made to a file. In that shift, time became an asset. Those who could act quickly with counsel and documentation already prepared could secure priority or recover collateral while others were still waiting for clarity. The practical advantage often began with something as plain as correspondence. Corporate depositors and well-positioned counterparties had ledgers of their own, daily statements, drafts, and promissory notes that could be produced on demand. Smaller depositors had passbooks and memory. When the receiver demanded proof, the difference mattered. The action was concrete. Claims that could be supported immediately were processed first, while others were delayed, returned for correction, or reduced to general creditor status. The consequence was financial, but it was also reputational. A creditor recorded as unverified was treated not as defrauded, but as disorganized. Certain obligations were also structured to survive the bank's collapse intact. Collateralized loans did not enter the same queue as unsecured. Deposits, notes tied to specific securities, could be enforced through separate channels, insulated from the slower machinery of receivership. In 1894, this meant that the most sophisticated counterparties did not merely recover more, they recovered sooner, at moments when distressed assets were still available and legal uncertainty had not yet hardened into precedent. Court involvement added another layer. When disputes arose, they did not unfold in public debate, but in motions and orders that read as technical housekeeping. A filing in the New York Supreme Court could determine whether a contested asset remained in the estate or moved into private control pending resolution. The action was procedural, stays granted, liens recognized, transfers affirmed. The consequence was structural. Each ruling converted ambiguity into a stable outcome that later appeared inevitable. The bank's physical presence was also processed this way. Its building did not fall with the institution. It was reassigned. The signage could come down, the interior could be repurposed, and the address could continue functioning under a different name with minimal disruption to the street-level narrative. The change was legal rather than theatrical. Leases were rewritten, fixtures inventoried, vault access transferred under documented authority. The consequence was social. A place associated with failure became, within a season, a place associated with continuity. Records followed the same pattern. The receiver's files were designed for settlement, not storytelling. They captured what was necessary to complete transactions and close disputes, and they ignored what did not serve that function. A classification that once explained why cash access narrowed was irrelevant to closing a deed or endorsing a bond. The action, again, was a mission by design. The consequence was historical. Later readers encountered outcomes without causes, transfers without context, and a narrative that reduced collapse. To panic conditions, what is most revealing is how clean the paperwork becomes once the institution is no longer alive. The mess of the crisis, withdrawals, hurried meetings, shifting support, does not appear in the final instruments. By the time an assignment is signed or a lien is recorded, the language is calm. The system speaks most clearly after the damage is done. It produces documents that are stable, defensible, and detached from the decisions that created the conditions for their necessity. This is how silence sustains itself, not through secrecy alone, but through the conversion of events into procedures that leave no space for motive. Once the receiver's work progresses, the bank becomes a settled matter, and settled matters do not invite investigation. They invite closure. By late 1894, the estate is smaller, cleaner, and easier to finish. Disputed items are separated, uncontested items are transferred, and the remaining losses are distributed across those least able to contest them. The consequence is not only the concentration of wealth, but the concentration of interpretation. A few actors possess complete records. The public receives only the final summaries. The last image is almost clerical. A stamped order authorizing a transfer, a receiver's signature beneath a formal caption, and a registry entry that updates an address as though nothing dramatic ever occurred there. The assets have moved, the files are thinning, and what remains is the next phase of the disappearance. where the institution's name and the reasons it mattered begin to fade from the record altogether. By 1895, the bank no longer failed in public view. It simply began to recede. There was no announcement marking its absence, no final notice explaining its fate. Instead, disappearance took the form of routine maintenance carried out across state banking reports and historical registries, where continuity depended on repetition. When a name stopped appearing, it did not draw attention. It was treated as administrative completion. The first omission occurred in the annual state banking summaries issued in 1895. These reports, compiled to document the condition of financial institutions operating under state and federal oversight, had previously listed the bank among those affected by the Panic of 1893. That year, its entry was gone. Not reclassified, not footnoted, simply removed. The action was concrete. A line that had existed the year before no longer did. The consequence was institutional. Without inclusion in annual summaries, the bank ceased to exist as an object of reference for regulators, historians, and the press. This removal did not violate any requirement. Once a bank's affairs were deemed settled, reporting obligations ended, yet the timing mattered. By 1895, questions about the panic were still circulating, and exclusions shaped which cases could be revisited. A bank absent from summaries could not be compared, audited, or reconsidered. It became, by definition, resolved. Historical registries followed the same pattern. Directories that tracked institutions over time adjusted their entries to reflect current reality. Addresses were reassigned. Charters were archived without annotation. The action was procedural. Records were updated to reflect present conditions. The consequence was archival. Future searches encountered gaps where continuity once existed. Correspondence vanished next. Letters exchanged between the bank and regulatory offices in 1893 and 1894 were no longer referenced in finding aids by the end of the decade. This did not mean they were destroyed. In many cases, they were refiled under broader categories, detached from the institution that generated them. Without explicit cross-referencing, their origin became opaque. The action was reclassification. The consequence was disconnection. Photographs followed a similar path. Images of the bank's headquarters, once used in promotional material, and internal documentation were absent from later compilations. Albums that recorded New York's financial architecture in the 1890s included neighboring buildings, but not this one. Whether the photographs were removed or simply never recopied cannot be determined. What is clear is that by 1900, visual traces of the institution were no longer circulating in official collections. This absence had practical effects. Historians assembling accounts of the Panic of 1893 relied on surviving summaries and compilations. Banks that appeared consistently in those sources became case studies. Those that did not were relegated to anonymity. The bank's disappearance from reports meant its experience could not easily be reconstructed. Its failure became a statistic absorbed into aggregate figures, stripped of narrative. Social memory adjusted accordingly. Families associated with the institution did not speak of it publicly. Business directories listed their other affiliations, unburdened by reference. To the bank, the cost of reputational damage was minimized not through defense, but through silence. When the institution vanished from record, the need to explain its fate vanished with it. By 1898, the disappearance was complete. State banking reports from that year made no mention of the bank, even in retrospective sections addressing the panic. Historical registries treated the period as closed. The institution's name no longer appeared in indexes where it had once been searchable. The action, removal, had achieved its effect. The consequence was erasure of institutional memory. What makes this phase distinctive is its ordinariness. No single action accounts for the disappearance. It resulted from many small, defensible steps, updates, consolidations, reclassifications. Each was justified. Together, they ensured that the bank would not be encountered again except by accident. The absence of correspondence is particularly revealing. Without letters, there is no dialogue to reconstruct. Decisions appear without deliberation. Outcomes appear without cause. The historical record becomes a sequence of conclusions unsupported by process. This is how disappearance functions within bureaucracy, not by denying events, but by severing their connections. By 1900, the physical site of the bank had also lost its association. The building remained, repurposed and renamed, its prior identity dissolved into the urban fabric. There was no plaque, no reference to what had occurred there during the panic. The space carried forward without memory. The consequence of this disappearance is institutional. When an entity is removed from summaries, registries, correspondence, and imagery, it cannot be interrogated. Its story cannot challenge prevailing narratives. The bank's experience, its solvency, its exclusion, its quiet end, ceased to exist as evidence. What remains are traces that do not align. A ledger here, a transfer there, a classification mark that points to something no longer named. These fragments survived because they were attached to processes that outlived the institution itself. The final image of this phase is an empty column in a report from the late 1890s where an entry once appeared. The paper is intact. The numbering continues. Only the name is gone. That absence resolves one tension by creating another. When records no longer match fragments that remain, disappearance gives way to inconsistency, the next place where the past begins to resist. Being fully erased. After 1900, disappearance took on a quieter form, one that no longer required active removal. It persisted through absence of reference, the kind that settles into routine and becomes difficult to distinguish from completeness. When later clerks compiled retrospective materials on 19th century banking, they relied on the same summaries and registries already stripped of the bank's name. What was not indexed could not be rediscovered. State archives illustrate this. Effect. Catalogues created in the first decade of the 20th century grouped financial records by institution only if those institutions still appeared in official summaries. Files tied to defunct banks were often folded into general categories labeled by year or subject rather than by name. The action was organizational, not punitive. The consequence was practical. Researchers scanning inventories would find no direct path back to the bank, even when fragments still existed under unrelated headings. The same process affected legislative materials. Hearings and committee reviews addressing the panic of 1893 referenced trends, totals, and representative cases. Institutions without a clear documentary trail were omitted, not by decision, but by default. By the time Congress and state legislatures revisited banking reform in the early 1900s, the bank's experience had already fallen outside the usable record. Its disappearance shaped the data that informed future policy. Private. Collections mirrored this pattern. Family papers from directors and trustees preserved correspondence on matters that remained relevant: railroads, trusts, real estate ventures. But letters connected to the bank were rarely retained as distinct items. They were either discarded as obsolete or absorbed into files labeled financial matters, losing their specificity. The action was selective retention. The consequence was fragmentation. Surviving documents could no longer be easily connected to one another. Maps and insurance surveys provide another trace of disappearance. Sanborn maps from the late 1890s still identified the bank building by function. Editions published after 1900 replaced that label with a generic description of use, reflecting its reassignment. This was not an erasure of structure, but of identity. The building persisted, the institution did not. Urban memory adjusted to the present tense. Newspapers contributed indirectly. As anniversaries of the panic passed, retrospective articles focused on lessons learned and reforms enacted. Lists of failed banks were shortened to illustrate scale, not detail. Names appeared and disappeared depending on available sources. Once omitted from these lists, an institution ceased to exist even as a cautionary example. The action was editorial simplification. The consequence was narrative narrowing. By 1905, the disappearance had become self-reinforcing. Archivists, journalists, and historians consulted the same. Secondary materials, all of which reflected the same omissions. No single actor was responsible. The system no longer needed to remove the bank's name. It had already succeeded in making it unnecessary. What remained was a mismatch between surviving artifacts and accepted accounts. Isolated documents, transfer records, clearinghouse classifications, ledger pages persisted because they were tied to processes broader than the bank itself. Yet without a named institution to anchor them, these records appeared anomalous. They lacked context, and without context they lacked meaning. This stage of disappearance is harder to detect because it resembles closure. There is no visible act, no decisive cut. Instead, relevance decays. The bank's absence becomes normal, and normality resists question. The cost of reputation has already been paid. The cost of memory is now distributed across bureaucracy. By the time professional historians of finance began systematizing accounts of the Gilded Age, the bank existed only as an absence. It could not be selected as a case study because it did not appear in the indexes used to identify candidates. Its story, therefore, did not compete with others. It simply was not told. This has a final institutional consequence. When disappearance reaches this stage, correction becomes unlikely. To restore the bank to history would require not only finding documents, but reassembling a chain that bureaucratic practice has deliberately thinned. Silence has done its work. The image that closes this extension is not empty space, but misalignment. A surviving clearinghouse notation pointing to a bank that no longer appears anywhere else, a reference without an entry. That misalignment does not resolve the past. It prepares the next tension, where absence gives way to something more problematic. Not silence, but contradiction, when fragments that survived begin to disagree with the record that replaced them. By the time the bank's name had faded, from summaries and registries, what remained were fragments that no longer agreed with one another. The first inconsistency appears when dates are placed side by side rather than read in isolation. A suspension order issued in 1893 establishes a clear administrative endpoint. From that moment forward, the institution was no longer authorized to operate. Yet a ledger entry bearing the bank's seal and internal numbering is dated several days after that order. The document is routine in form, complete in structure, and incompatible in timing. The ledger does not announce itself as exceptional. It records balances, reserve positions, and daily movements using the same format employed before the suspension. The action it reflects is ordinary, the continuation of accounting practice. The problem lies in its existence. After a suspension order, no such entry should have been created. The date places the document on the wrong side of authority, and that placement cannot be reconciled through clerical error alone. This discrepancy deepens when the ledger is compared to filings associated with the comptroller of the currency. Reports submitted under that office's oversight establish the bank's status as suspended and inactive. They do not reference post-suspension accounting activity. The action recorded by the comptroller is definitive. The consequence is legal clarity. And yet the ledger contradicts that clarity by implying that internal processes continued, at least briefly. After formal authority had been withdrawn, signatures complicate the picture further. Across documents dated in late 1893, the same officers appear with signatures that differ in placement and sequence. In some filings, a senior officer signs in a position consistent with active management. In others, dated within the same period, that signature is absent or displaced, replaced by a trustee's mark. The inconsistency is not stylistic. It reflects a shift in control that does not align cleanly with the timeline established by official orders. The action here is conflicting authorization. Documents suggest that responsibility changed hands, but not at a single, identifiable moment. Instead, authority appears to overlap. The consequence is administrative ambiguity. If management had ceased, its signatures should not appear. If trustees had assumed control, their signatures should be exclusive. The record shows neither condition fully satisfied. Financial figures add another layer. Reserve amounts reported in late 1893 filings differ depending on context. In statements addressed to regulatory offices, reserves are listed as intact and compliant with requirements. In internal clearing records, accessible reserves appear markedly lower. The values are not arithmetically inconsistent, they are functionally incompatible. One set reflects assets on paper, the other reflects cash available for immediate settlement. This mismatch reveals a distinction that the official timeline does not acknowledge. Reserves existed, but access to them did not. The ledger dated after suspension records balances that could not be mobilized under the restrictions already in place. The action was reporting. The consequence was misalignment between solvency and operability. When these documents are read together, they describe two parallel realities that never intersect. Such inconsistencies would have mattered greatly at the time. In the 1890s, trust in financial institutions depended on clear sequence: authority, action, consequence. When sequence breaks down, responsibility becomes difficult to assign. That difficulty is evident here. No single document is fraudulent. No entry is obviously false. The inconsistency arises only when records are placed in dialogue with one another. The danger of this misalignment is historical as well as administrative. Later summaries rely on simplified timelines. Suspension follows distress. Liquidation follows suspension. The ledger dated after suspension disrupts that narrative. It suggests that internal accounting continued after public authority had ended, raising questions about what information was known, when it was known, and who had access to it. The comptroller's role underscores the problem. As the federal authority overseeing national banks, the office represented finality. Its orders were meant to settle status. Yet the surviving ledger implies that finality was not immediate in practice. The gap between order and effect is not documented. It exists only as an inconsistency between records. This inconsistency has consequences beyond chronology. If accounting continued after suspension, even briefly, it implies that some actors operated in a liminal period where rules were unclear or selectively applied. That period is absent from official accounts. It survives only through documents that were not meant to be reconciled. Which record was meant to survive? The question arises because survival appears selective. The suspension order is preserved because it established authority. The ledger survives because it was filed with other routine materials. What does not survive is an explanation bridging the two. No memo clarifies why accounting entries continued. No notation resolves the overlap of signatures. The inconsistency stands without commentary. The final image of this phase is a file laid open on a desk. A suspension order dated 1893 on one side, a ledger entry dated days later on the other. Both are intact. Both are official in appearance. They do not agree. The tension they create is contained but unresolved, and it prepares the next stage of the investigation, where the question is no longer whether records conflict, but what would happen if such conflicts were openly examined beyond the safety of the archive and into the realm of risk. By the late 1890s, the panic of 1893 had been absorbed into a broader national story of recovery. Markets had stabilized. New capital returned. Newspapers spoke of renewed confidence and industrial momentum. Yet the architecture of that recovery rested on a fragile agreement that the mechanisms used to contain the crisis would not be publicly examined in a way that threatened the legitimacy of the institutions that administered them. If the inconsistencies in this case had become public during that period, the consequences would not have been limited to one bank's reputation. The risk would have spread outward. Because the documents imply something larger than a failed institution, they imply that access to liquidity could be restricted through committee action while solvency remained intact, and that the public narrative of failure could be maintained through softened language and selective reporting. In the late 1890s, exposing that dynamic would have challenged the credibility of the financial system's informal governance at the very moment it was trying to present itself as stable. The financial press was central to this risk. In 1897 and 1898, Wall Street newspapers were not merely observers. They were part of the confidence structure. Their restraint during the panic had been framed as responsibility. If evidence emerged that restraint also served to conceal the difference between liquidity exclusion and insolvency, it would have raised immediate questions about complicity. Editors would have been forced to explain why certain mechanisms were not described, why certain classifications were not discussed, and why a solvent institution's collapse was reduced to an inevitable consequence of conditions. Markets would have reacted to that uncertainty. The late 1890s were a period in which trust companies expanded their role, and the financial ecosystem grew more complex. If depositors came to believe that survival depended on discretionary inclusion rather than measurable solvency, they would have adjusted behavior accordingly. Withdrawals could have shifted toward institutions perceived as politically protected. Correspondent relationships could have tightened, credit could have contracted. The very idea that liquidity access was conditional would have introduced a new and destabilizing variable into market behavior. Political allies would have felt the pressure quickly. In the Gilded Age and its immediate aftermath, banking was not a neutral sector. It was intertwined with political patronage, reform movements, and debates over the legitimacy of concentrated financial power. By 1898, public distrust of elites had not disappeared. It had changed form. An exposure suggesting that committee actions could determine which banks lived and which failed, independent of solvency, would have been interpreted as favoritism at best and manipulation at worst. The concrete action that would have triggered this backlash is simple: publication. A journalist placing the clearinghouse report beside the suspension order and the post-suspension ledger entry would have created a narrative the public could understand without technical training. The story would not need sensational language. It would rely on dates, stamps, and signatures. The consequence would have been institutional. The credibility of clearinghouse governance would be questioned, and questions of governance tend to spread faster than financial facts. Contagion is often understood as a market phenomenon, but in the late 1890s, contagion could also be reputational. If one solvent bank could be denied liquidity without public explanation, any institution could be suspected of being vulnerable to the same discretion. That suspicion alone would have altered depositor behavior. Banks could have been forced to hoard cash rather than lend. Interest rates could have risen. The recovery narrative could have weakened, not because fundamentals changed, but because the public's understanding of risk shifted. The legal consequences would also have been significant. Depositors and shareholders might have sought remedies not only against the bank's officers, but against trustees and institutions involved in the liquidity restrictions. Even if such suits failed, the discovery process would have threatened exposure of internal records. Committees would have been forced to defend practices that were never meant to be litigated. The system's reliance on informal authority would have come under legal scrutiny. This is why silence was valuable. It protected the clearinghouse from having to explain discretionary power. It protected the press from admitting editorial restraint with consequences. It protected political allies from being connected to decisions framed as administrative rather than strategic. And it protected markets from confronting a form of risk that could not be quantified through balance sheets. The bank's disappearance from annual summaries and registries must be understood in this light. Removal did not only serve memory, it served stability. In the late 1890s, stability was fragile enough that institutions treated certain truths as hazardous, not because they were false, but because they were destabilizing. There is also a social consequence that is often overlooked. Public exposure would have disrupted the inheritance of credibility. Families and institutions that weathered the panic emerged with their reputations intact, and those reputations became assets. If it became known that survival depended on discretionary inclusion, inherited credibility would look less like merit and more like protection. That shift would have affected not only markets but social standing, philanthropy, and the narrative of respectable wealth. The risk, then, was not a single scandal. It was a chain reaction. The revelation of liquidity manipulation, or more precisely of liquidity restriction applied selectively, would have reframed the panic as a story of governance rather than misfortune. It would have invited questions about who decided, who benefited, and who was excluded. In the late 1890s, those were politically combustible questions. The documents themselves suggest an awareness of this risk. Language softening after 1893, the lack of explanatory notes, the absence of cross-references that would make reconciliation easy. All of these functioned as barriers to the kind of public narrative that could trigger backlash. None of this required a conspiracy. It required only shared incentives. Keep confidence intact. Keep institutions credible. Keep recovery plausible. What makes this phase of the investigation advance is that it reframes silence as a defensive strategy rather than a passive absence. By the late 1890s, the system had learned that certain records were safe only if they remained disconnected. The inconsistencies could exist so long as they could not be assembled into a single story. The final image here is a newspaper office in 1898 with a financial column laid out for print and a file that never makes it to the desk. A clearinghouse report and a ledger entry that remain in separate drawers, because bringing them together would not merely explain one bank's collapse, it would reopen the panic itself. And with that risk understood, the next step becomes predictable. The methods that protected silence begin to harden into routine, turning ad hoc restraint into normal procedure. Between 1900 and 1910, the story of the bank no longer depended on what was said or unsaid in newspapers. It depended on how records were handled. The decade after the panic was an era of institutional consolidation. Banking committees refined internal procedures. Archival offices modernized cataloging practices. The language of record-keeping became more standardized, more technical, and, in practice, more capable of turning omission into routine. In 1901, many financial institutions in New York were reorganizing their internal files in response to expanding volume. Ledgers, clearinghouse correspondence, committee minutes, and receiver documents from the 1890s were no longer active materials. They became legacy records. Once records enter that category, their fate is governed less by relevance to truth and more by relevance to administration. The question is not what they prove, but what they are used for. Archival offices adopted classifications that served this administrative goal. Files were marked restricted, maintenance, or preservation, labels that sounded neutral but carried consequences. Restricted reduced access to a limited group. Maintenance justified reorganization, consolidation, and in some cases, removal of duplicate materials. Preservation prioritized physical survival over contextual integrity, often separating documents from the chains that made them interpretable. The action that transformed silence into procedure was reclassification. A clearinghouse report that once had the potential to explain liquidity restriction could be refiled not under the bank's name, but under a broader category such as panic materials, 1893. A receiver's correspondence could be detached from the institution and placed under trusteeship general. The documents still existed, but the pathway to connect them was dissolved. Banking committees reinforced this logic. Minutes from early 1900s committee meetings show a growing emphasis on discretion, not in the sense of secrecy, but in the sense of institutional risk management. The committees did not speak of cover-ups. They spoke of confidence, stability, and non-disclosure of sensitive operational measures. The action was formalization of language that justified withholding without admitting intent. By 1904, the labeling had hardened into precedent. Records that touched liquidity interventions were more likely to be treated as operationally sensitive even years after the fact. This sensitivity did not require a new crisis. It was justified by the memory of the old one. The panic of 1893 had taught institutions that certain mechanics, if publicly understood, could accelerate panic. The lesson became policy. The consequence of this policy was the normalization of omission. It was no longer necessary to remove a bank's name from summaries if the relevant explanatory documents were simply unreachable, uncatalogued under the expected headings, or separated from the identifiers that made them searchable. Silence became structural rather than discretionary. It was built into the filing system. This structural silence also shaped how later narratives were constructed. Between 1900 and 1910, professionalized financial reporting expanded. Writers compiling retrospectives relied on accessible sources, published reports, indexable registries, and public statements. Files marked restricted were not part of that ecosystem. Records filed under generic crisis categories without institutional cross-references were difficult to locate and even harder to interpret. The consequence was historiographical. The story that survived was the one that could be assembled from public material. The routine language of archival offices reinforced this outcome. A record moved for preservation might be separated from related correspondence to prevent physical damage, but the separation also prevented contextual reconstruction. A record placed under maintenance could be consolidated with certain materials deemed redundant and removed. Redundancy, in this context, often meant documents that repeated details, rather than documents that repeated conclusions. The system preserved outcomes more reliably than it preserved process. This is the subtle shift that occurred in the decade after 1900. Institutions did not need to falsify records. They only needed to ensure that the records that clarified process were difficult to assemble. When process becomes inaccessible, outcomes become self-justifying. A bank failed. A panic occurred. Recovery followed. The sequence stands, even if the mechanism is missing. The bank's case, in this environment, became a category rather than an event. It belonged to 1893 panic files, rather than to a specific institutional timeline. The clearinghouse report existed, but not as a key. The ledger entry dated after suspension existed, but not as an anomaly requiring explanation. Each document survived in isolation, preserved as paper, but stripped of narrative connection. Within banking committees, this isolation was defensible. Internal discussions in the early 1900s increasingly treated liquidity interventions as part of standard crisis management, not as extraordinary measures. The action was normalization of practice. The consequence was that earlier interventions were retroactively framed as routine, making them less likely to be singled out for review. The same logic applied to public inquiry. By the time reform debates gained momentum in the late 1900s, attention focused on broad structural issues: reserve adequacy, currency elasticity, and panic. Prevention. The discrete mechanics of clearinghouse exclusion were not central in public discourse, partly because the documentary trail that could have illustrated them was no longer readily visible. Silence had become the default posture, maintained not by active suppression, but by administrative architecture. The cost of this posture was borne by the integrity of institutional memory. Once omission becomes routine, correction becomes improbable. Not because anyone forbids it, but because the system no longer recognizes what needs correcting. Archives respond to queries. If no one can ask the right question because the names and pathways are missing, the archive appears complete even when it is not. By 1910, the process was mature. The language of restricted maintenance and preservation had stabilized. Committees treated discretion as professional responsibility. Archival offices treated contextual thinning as efficiency. The consequence was an enduring structure in which the bank's collapse could be remembered without its mechanics being understood. The final image of this phase is procedural. A file box labeled 1893, clearinghouse materials, a secondary folder marked restricted, and inside it a set of documents preserved in clean order, yet separated from the name that would make them searchable. Silence has become a method. And with method in place, the next question is not how the past was managed, but how the present inherited that management, how, even now, the legacy remains intact, while key explanations remain absent. After 1910, the procedures established in the prior decade did not remain confined to backrooms and filing cabinets. They became habits embedded in the professional culture of finance and record-keeping. What began as crisis-era caution matured into a default method for handling information that could undermine confidence. The system did not need to decide each time to be silent. It only needed to keep treating certain categories of material as outside the scope of ordinary access and ordinary narration. A practical example appears in how institutions handled requests. In the early 1910s, when researchers, journalists, or even internal auditors sought historical material, the response was increasingly routed through gatekeepers trained to interpret requests narrowly. If a question was framed around a bank's failure, the requester was directed toward public statements and published summaries. If the question touched clearing mechanisms, committee actions, or emergency liquidity, the response shifted to institutional policy. Unavailable, incomplete, or outside the archive's remit. The action was filtering. The consequence was a predictable narrowing of what could be learned. This filtering produced a second effect, the standardization of acceptable explanation. Over time, the narratives that were easiest to access became the narratives that were repeated. Banks failed because panic occurred. Panics occurred because confidence collapsed. Confidence collapsed because rumors spread. These statements were not false, but they were incomplete. They explained symptoms while bypassing the administrative mechanics that turned symptoms into outcomes. Once repeated enough, incompleteness resembled truth. The professional language of the era reinforced this. By the 1910s, institutional communication favored terms that minimized agency. Conditions tightened. Support was unavailable. Reserves proved insufficient. Passive constructions displaced active decisions. The action was linguistic drift. The consequence was moral and historical distance. It became difficult to identify who acted when and with what authority. This is where routine becomes powerful. A file need not be hidden if the vocabulary used to describe its contents dissolves responsibility. A decision need not be denied if it is reframed as an outcome of environment. In practice, this meant that even when documents survived, their interpretive framing was diluted through the same patterns that governed access. Training practices in archival and administrative offices contributed. Clerks learned classification not as storytelling, but as efficiency. They were taught to prioritize preservation of the object over preservation of its relational context. This shaped how marginal notes, cross-references, and supporting correspondence were treated. Items that did not serve immediate administrative function were less likely to be retained together. The action was routine separation. The consequence was long-term decontextualization. Banking committees, meanwhile, treated discretion as a sign of sophistication. The 1890s had demonstrated how quickly public understanding of mechanics could destabilize behavior. By the 1910s, that lesson was professionalized. Committee discussions referenced confidence management as an operational responsibility, not as an ethical dilemma. The action was institutionalization of caution. The consequence was that transparency became selectively applied, encouraged in some areas, discouraged in others. This selective transparency also shaped what was preserved in published form. Annual reports became more polished, more consistent, and less granular in areas where granularity could expose operational discretion. The surface of the system became cleaner, while the interior became more guarded. For historians, this produced a paradox. The further forward in time one moved, the more professional the documentation appeared, and the harder it became to identify the mechanics that mattered most during stress. The bank at the center of this investigation is a product of this paradox. Its case was not only removed from the public narrative, it was absorbed into a pattern of explanation that made removal appear unnecessary. Once the system learned how to explain without revealing, absence became redundant. The records could exist and still not function as evidence in the public sphere. The long consequence is structural. When omission is procedural, it reproduces itself across generations of record keepers and committee members. People inherit the method without needing to inherit the motive. By the time the motive becomes historically interesting, the method has already done its work. The closing image of this extension is subtle but concrete. A request form dated in the 1910s, routed through an office stamp that reads "reviewed." followed by a short written response, directing the requester to published summaries. Somewhere else, in a controlled file, the materials that would change the explanation remain intact, but unoffered. Silence, at this point, is not an act. It is the default setting, and the present investigation is now approaching the moment where that default collides with modern expectation, forcing the question of what still remains unexplained today. In 2026, the language used to explain 19th century bank failures appears settled. Modern financial regulators, academic summaries, and public-facing historical narratives continue to cite familiar causes: panic conditions, deposit of fear, insufficient reserves. These explanations are repeated in textbooks, regulatory retrospectives, and institutional websites that trace the evolution of American banking stability. The action is subtle but concrete. Simplified explanations are cited, restated, and reaffirmed, while more complex mechanisms are left unaddressed. The consequence is institutional continuity. The past remains usable without being disruptive. This continuity matters because present-day frameworks inherit authority from historical precedent. When regulators in the 21st century describe how banking systems learned from the failures of the 1890s, they rely on a version of events that emphasizes structural reform over discretionary intervention. The narrative suggests that instability was corrected by better rules, stronger reserves, and clearer oversight. What is not explained is how, even under rule-based systems, access to liquidity can still hinge on discretionary judgments that rarely appear in public summaries. The absence is measurable. Contemporary regulatory documents frequently reference the Panic of 1893 as an example of why central banking functions were eventually formalized. They cite systemic vulnerability, not selective exclusion. Liquidity decisions made by clearinghouse committees are mentioned as historical context, not as points of contention. The action here is omission by abstraction. By framing the past at a high level, the narrative avoids the granular decisions that complicate lessons drawn for the present. This has a direct effect on how legacy is preserved. Institutions that survived and evolved from the Gilded Age into modern finance are presented as resilient actors shaped by reform. Their continuity reinforces confidence. To revisit episodes where solvency and failure diverged due to discretionary liquidity restriction would introduce ambiguity into that confidence. As a result, the past is curated to support present legitimacy. In 2026, the bank at the center of this investigation still does not appear as a case study. It exists only indirectly, absorbed into aggregate statistics and generalized descriptions of panic-era instability. The ledger, the clearinghouse classification, the post-suspension accounting entry, none are cited in contemporary overviews. The action is continued non-reference. The consequence is that the institution's experience cannot inform current understanding of how discretionary power operates during stress. Modern financial regulators emphasize transparency and stress testing, yet the historical foundation of these practices is rarely interrogated beyond surface narratives. Stress tests model hypothetical shocks, but they assume rules are applied uniformly. The historical record examined here suggests that uniformity has never been absolute. Decisions about liquidity access have always involved judgment, coordination, and prioritization. By leaving those elements out of historical explanation, present frameworks inherit a simplified ancestry. Historical narratives also shape public trust. Museums, documentaries, and educational materials present the Gilded Age as a period of excess corrected by reform. That arc is reassuring. It suggests progress, introducing evidence that discretionary exclusion played a decisive role in certain failures would complicate that arc. It would raise questions about whether similar discretion exists today, even under more formalized systems. The cost of such questions is reputational, not only for institutions, but for the story of progress itself. The action that sustains this outcome is repetition. Each time a simplified explanation is cited, it gains authority. Each time liquidity decisions are left unnamed, they become harder to reintroduce. Over time, absence acquires the weight of consensus. What is not explained is treated as either irrelevant or unknowable. In practice, it is neither. It is merely unincorporated. The legacy that remains intact is therefore not neutral. It is shaped. Families, institutions, and regulatory bodies that trace lineage to the Gilded Age continue to occupy positions of credibility. Their histories are presented without the friction that unresolved mechanisms would introduce. The bank's disappearance from narrative allows continuity to appear smooth, uninterrupted by questions of discretion and exclusion. This does not mean the records are gone. In 2026, they still exist in archival form, preserved under the classifications established decades earlier. They are accessible in theory, but difficult to assemble in practice. The action of preservation without integration has succeeded. The consequence is that modern discourse can proceed as though the story is complete. The present connection, then, is not about rediscovery, but about inheritance. The systems that manage information today inherited methods developed to protect confidence in the past. Those methods continue to determine what is emphasized and what is omitted. The bank's case illustrates how a specific experience can be absorbed, neutralized, and rendered invisible without ever being disproven. What remains unexplained is not a single decision, but a pattern. How often did liquidity access, rather than solvency, determine survival? How frequently were those decisions framed as inevitable outcomes rather than discretionary choices? These questions are absent from mainstream accounts, not because they lack evidence, but because their answers would complicate the legacy that modern institutions rely upon. The consequence of this absence is subtle but enduring. When future crises occur, they are interpreted through the same lens that shaped understanding of the past. Discretion is minimized, structure is emphasized. Responsibility is diffused. The cycle continues, supported by a historical narrative that appears settled precisely because certain mechanisms were never fully integrated into it. The closing image of this phase is contemporary and concrete. A modern regulatory report published in 2026, its historical section summarizing 19th century panics in a single paragraph, confident and untroubled, while somewhere else a digitized ledger entry remains disconnected from that summary. The past and present sit side by side, aligned on the surface, separated underneath. An alignment that holds for now and sets the stage for the final question of this investigation. Not what happened, but what it means when the record survives without ever being fully acknowledged. In the official record, the bank failed because panic arrived. A familiar ending, clean enough to cite, stable enough to teach. Yet the surviving fragments insist on a less comfortable order of events. Not collapse first, then explanation, but decision first, quiet, administrative, and irreversible, followed by language adjusted to make the outcome appear inevitable. That is the institutional moral the ledgers cannot state outright. In these halls of finance, liquidity was never merely a technical detail. It was authority in its most practical form, the power to decide whose solvency would matter and whose would become irrelevant in a week. Accounting can describe assets. It cannot compel access. And when access is controlled by committees, trustees, and procedures that leave no public fingerprint, The balance sheet becomes a ceremonial document, correct on paper, powerless in time. What endures from the 1890s is not only the lesson of instability, but the method of containment. A crash is visible, a committee decision is not, a run leaves headlines, a restriction leaves classifications. The public remembers the noise, institutions remember the lever, and once the lever is pulled, the rest of the narrative can be arranged. Status softened, summaries shortened, correspondence refiled, photographs absent, names thinned from the ledgers of memory until even the question sounds unfamiliar. The bank's fate, in that sense, is less a singular tragedy than a template. The most consequential act did not take place on a trading floor or in a crowd at a teller window. It occurred in a closed room in August 1893, where containment was authorized and the flow of cash was redirected. Everything that followed, receivership, asset absorption, language revised for public notices, was consequence, not cause. The institution did not fall because it was empty. It fell because time ran out before permission returned. And this is why the truth remains unsettled. The record survived, but not in the manner that allows restoration. It survived in pieces. An order here, a ledger there, signatures that do not align, reserves that exist in one document and vanish in another. What did not survive was the bridge, the explanation that would connect authority to outcome in a single, accountable line. In its place stands a system of labels that still feel modern in their efficiency. Restricted, maintenance, preservation, words that protect paper while starving meaning. In 2026, we speak comfortably of transparency and oversight, as if the past were only a rough draft of the present. Yet the pattern uncovered here suggests something more enduring, that history is shaped less by the crises we watch and more by the procedures we never see. The financial system does not only respond to events, it edits them, quietly, incrementally, until the official version can be recited without touching the mechanism that made it true. So the halls remain intact. The facade stands, the narrative holds, and somewhere behind it, in a file that was never meant to meet its neighbor, a contradiction waits, preserved, unintegrated, and therefore safe. If you've followed this investigation to its final corridor, leave. Your thoughts below? Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. If this story resonated with you, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again. And consider subscribing, so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens. Because if you're willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. For in institutions built to outlast individuals, permanence is often a performance. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth.